The private dining room at Spago overlooked the twinkling lights of West Hollywood as some of cinema's most celebrated actors gathered for an intimate dinner following the AFI Life Achievement Award ceremony. March 15, 1987. Al Pacino sat at the elegantly appointed table, still wearing his black tuxedo from the evening's festivities, engaging in the kind of thoughtful conversation that happened when serious artists found themselves in the same room without cameras or press obligations. The dinner had been organized by producer David Geffen as a way for the evening's honorees and presenters to decompress after the formal ceremony. 12 of Hollywood's most respected performers sat around a table that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, sharing wine and stories in the kind of relaxed atmosphere that allowed guards to drop and real conversations to emerge. Al sat between Robert De Niro and Jessica Lange, both longtime friends who understood his approach to the craft and shared similar commitments to finding truth in their performances. Across the table, Meryl Streep commanded attention with her characteristic intelligence and wit, discussing her preparation for an upcoming film with the kind of technical precision that had made her one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation. At 47, Al had established himself as one of the defining actors of the past 2 decades. The Godfather trilogy, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, and Scarface had cemented his reputation as someone who brought unprecedented psychological depth to every role. His method acting approach was well known in the industry: the months of preparation, the complete immersion in character psychology, the willingness to risk personal stability for artistic truth. Meryl, 38 and already recognized as perhaps the most technically gifted actress of her generation, represented a different school of acting. Where Al disappeared into characters through psychological transformation, Meryl became other people through meticulous technical craft, perfecting accents, mastering physical mannerisms, building characters from the outside in with stunning precision. The conversation had been flowing naturally between various topics. Upcoming projects, industry changes, the craft of acting itself. Everyone at the table was comfortable discussing their work with peers who understood the challenges and rewards of their profession. The wine was excellent, the atmosphere was relaxed, and the evening felt like one of those rare moments when competitive colleagues could simply enjoy each other's company. "I've always been fascinated by different approaches to character development," said Jack Nicholson, who sat at the head of the table with the casual authority of someone who'd never met a room he couldn't command. "We've got representatives of just about every acting school sitting right here." The comment drew knowing chuckles from around the table. Everyone present had developed their own methods for creating believable characters, and the diversity of approaches represented decades of artistic evolution in American cinema. "It's interesting how differently people prepare," added Glenn Close, who was seated next to Meryl. "Some actors research extensively, others rely on instinct, others focus on technical perfection." Al nodded thoughtfully, swirling the wine in his glass. "I think the approach has to match what the character demands. Some roles require you to go very deep psychologically, to really live in that person's headspace for extended periods. That's exactly what I find problematic about method acting," Meryl said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that made people pay attention when she spoke. The comment landed with more weight than perhaps she'd intended. Conversations around the table quieted slightly as people sensed that a significant topic had been introduced. Al looked up from his wine glass, his dark eyes focusing on Meryl with interest rather than defensiveness. "Problematic in what way?" Al asked, his voice curious but carrying an edge that suggested this wasn't casual dinner conversation anymore. Meryl set down her wine glass and leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful but determined. "I think method acting, as it's practiced by many actors today, has become fundamentally selfish." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Even the ambient sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade as everyone at the table processed what had just been said. This wasn't gentle critique or professional disagreement, this was a direct challenge to the artistic approach that had defined Al's entire career. "Selfish," Al repeated, his voice neutral but his posture indicating that he was now fully engaged in what had become a much more serious conversation. Meryl nodded, her expression remaining calm and intellectual. "Yes, selfish. Method acting prioritizes the actor's psychological journey over the collaborative nature of filmmaking. It puts personal exploration above professional responsibility. The other actors at the table exchanged glances, recognizing that they were about to witness a debate between two of the most respected performers of their generation. Robert De Niro, himself a committed method actor, shifted slightly in his seat but remained silent, perhaps curious to see how Al would respond to such a direct challenge. When an actor spends months disappearing into a character's psychology, Meryl continued, they're essentially saying that their personal artistic process is more important than the director's vision, the other actor's needs, or the production's requirements. Al's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained controlled when he responded. And you think focusing on character truth is selfish? I think obsessing over character psychology to the point where it affects your ability to collaborate effectively is selfish, Meryl replied. Acting is a collaborative art form. When one person's preparation method dominates the entire production, that's not artistry, that's ego. The criticism was delivered with surgical precision, targeting not just Al's method but questioning the very foundation of his artistic integrity. Several people at the table looked uncomfortable, recognizing that this had moved beyond professional disagreement into personal territory. Al set down his wine glass with deliberate care, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building intensity. Meryl, can I ask how much you know about method acting preparation? I know enough to understand that it often becomes an excuse for unprofessional behavior, she replied, her tone remaining conversational but her words carrying unmistakable challenge. I've seen actors use staying in character as justification for being difficult, demanding, or impossible to work with. Have you seen me be unprofessional? Al asked, his voice quiet but focused. Meryl paused, perhaps recognizing that she was moving into territory that could damage professional relationships. I'm not talking about you specifically, Al. I'm talking about method acting as an approach. But you're sitting at a table with someone who's built his career on that approach, Al replied, so it's hard not to take it personally when you call it fundamentally selfish. The tension at the table was now palpable. Jessica Lange looked between Al and Meryl with obvious concern, while Jack Nicholson watched with the fascination of someone who enjoyed intellectual combat. The other dinner guests seemed frozen between wanting to intervene and wanting to see how this would play out. Here's what I think is really selfish, Al said, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous, but controlled and focused rather than explosive. But before he could continue, a waiter appeared to refill wine glasses, unaware that he was interrupting what had become one of the most significant artistic debates of the evening. But before he could continue, a waiter appeared to refill wine glasses, unaware that he was interrupting what had become one of the most significant artistic debates of the evening. The brief pause seemed to give Al a moment to gather his thoughts, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not defensive, but deeply passionate about something he'd spent his life perfecting. Here's what I think is really selfish, Meryl, Al said, his voice taking on the controlled intensity that had defined his most memorable performances. What's selfish is dismissing an artistic approach that you've never fully committed to because it makes you uncomfortable. The waiter, sensing the tension at the table, quickly finished his rounds and disappeared, leaving the 12 actors alone with a conversation that was rapidly becoming something none of them would ever forget. Al leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on Meryl with laser focus. You say method acting is about putting personal exploration above professional responsibility. But let me ask you something, when you spend weeks perfecting a Polish accent for Sophie's Choice, is that selfish? When you research historical figures for months to capture their speech patterns and mannerisms, is that unprofessional? Meryl opened her mouth to respond, but Al was already continuing, his voice gaining momentum. Because that's external method work, Meryl. You're doing research, you're transforming yourself physically and vocally to become someone else. The only difference is that you stop at the surface level. You perfect the accent, you nail the physicality, you get the mannerisms exactly right. But you never ask the deeper question. What deeper question? Meryl asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. What does it feel like to be Sophie? Not what does she sound like, not how does she move, but what is it like to live inside her psychology? What is it like to carry the guilt of choosing which of your children lives and which one dies? What does that do to a human soul? Al's voice was building now, not getting louder but gaining depth and resonance, filling the private dining room with the kind of presence that explained why he was considered one of the most compelling actors of his generation. That's what method acting really is, Meryl. It's not about being difficult or demanding or impossible to work with. It's about having the courage to explore the psychological truth of another human being, even when that exploration is uncomfortable or dangerous. Robert De Niro nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing the passion in Al's voice as something he'd experienced himself during his own character preparation. Jessica Lange watched with fascination, seeing a side of Al that was rarely displayed in public. "You want to talk about selfish?" Al continued, standing from his chair with fluid grace. "Selfish is staying safe. Selfish is refusing to risk anything real for your art. Selfish is building a career on technical competence without ever exploring what it might cost you psychologically to truly become someone else." Meryl's composure flickered for the first time, perhaps recognizing that Al had turned her criticism back on her with devastating precision. "When I prepared for Serpico," Al said, his voice taking on a different quality, more intimate but somehow more powerful, "I didn't just research police procedure and practice a New York accent. I spent months understanding what it feels like to be the only honest man in a corrupt system. I learned what it costs psychologically to risk everything for principles that nobody else seems to care about." Al began moving around the table, his energy electric but controlled, like a professor delivering the most important lecture of his career. "I rode with undercover narcotics officers, Meryl. I watched deals go bad, I saw people die, I felt what it was like to know that one wrong word could get you killed. Not because I wanted to be difficult or demanding, but because I needed to understand the psychology of a man willing to sacrifice everything for integrity." Glenn Close shifted in her seat, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a master actor defending not just his craft but his entire artistic philosophy. "And when I was preparing for Scarface," Al continued, "I didn't just learn a Cuban accent and watch gangster movies. I spent months in Miami understanding what desperation looks like, what ambition costs, what it means to believe that the world owes you everything and to be willing to take it by force." Al's voice was gaining strength with each word, his passion for his craft becoming more evident with every sentence. "I met with people who'd lived that life, Meryl. I learned what it feels like to be so hungry for success that you destroy everything beautiful about yourself to achieve it. That's not selfish preparation, that's artistic commitment to truth." Jack Nicholson leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips as he recognized that he was watching a master class in passionate artistic defense. "You say method acting puts personal exploration above collaboration," Al said, returning to stand near his chair but not sitting down. "But here's what you don't understand. When I disappear completely into a character's psychology, I bring everything I've discovered to the collaboration. Every scene partner, every director, every person involved in the production gets the benefit of months of psychological research." Al looked around the table, making eye contact with each actor present. "When Marlon Brando worked with me in The Godfather, he didn't get Al Pacino reading lines. He got Michael Corleone, completely formed, with a full psychological history and emotional reality. When I worked with Brian De Palma on Scarface, he didn't have to explain Tony Montana's motivation to me, I had lived inside that psychology for months." Meryl's expression had shifted from confident challenge to something approaching thoughtful reconsideration. "That's not selfish, Meryl," Al continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. "That's the most generous thing an actor can do, bring a fully realized human being to the collaboration instead of asking everyone else to help you figure out who your character is." Al sat back down, but his energy remained electric, his presence undimmed. "You want to know what's really selfish? Relying on technical skill alone. Building a career on being able to do accents and mannerisms without ever risking your own psychological stability for the truth of a character." The silence that followed was profound. Meryl stared at Al for a long moment, perhaps processing not just his words but the passionate conviction behind them. "But Al," she said, her voice softer now, less confrontational, "doesn't that level of psychological immersion take a toll on you personally? Don't you lose pieces of yourself in all these different characters?" Al smiled for the first time since the conversation began, but it wasn't a happy expression. "Of course it does. You think I don't know the cost? You think I haven't spent nights unable to sleep because I couldn't stop thinking like Frank Serpico or Tony Montana or Michael Corleone?" Al's voice took on a new quality, more vulnerable but no less powerful. "Every role I take costs me something, Meryl. Every character I become changes me in ways I can't always control. When I played Frank Slade in Scent of a Woman, I spent 4 months learning to live without sight. Do you know what that does to your relationship with the world? Do you know how it changes the way you think about everything you take for granted?" Al looked directly at Meryl, his eyes intense but no longer combative. "But that's the price of truth, Meryl. That's what it costs to bring something real to audiences instead of something safe. And I'd rather risk losing pieces of myself than give audiences a performance that doesn't challenge them to feel something genuine." Dustin Hoffman, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Al, I think what Meryl might be saying is that there are other ways to find truth in a character without necessarily—" "No," Al interrupted gently, "I know what Meryl is saying. She's saying that my approach is self-indulgent, that it prioritizes my artistic process over the needs of the production. And I'm saying that's exactly backwards." Al turned back to Meryl, his voice taking on a new intensity. "When Daniel Day-Lewis disappears into Abraham Lincoln for months, when he refuses to break character even between takes, that's not selfish, that's the most generous gift he can give to everyone involved in that production. Because every person working on that film gets to work with Abraham Lincoln, not with Daniel Day-Lewis pretending to be Abraham Lincoln." The distinction was subtle but profound, and everyone at the table seemed to understand that Al had articulated something important about the relationship between artistic preparation and collaborative responsibility. "You're one of the most technically skilled actors of our generation, Meryl," Al continued, his tone becoming more respectful but no less passionate. "Your accent work is flawless, your physical transformations are stunning, your emotional range is extraordinary. But when you dismiss method acting as selfish, you're dismissing the possibility that technique alone might not be enough to access the deepest truths of human psychology." Meryl was quiet for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that Al had challenged not just her criticism but her entire approach to the craft. "I suppose," she said finally, "that we have very different philosophies about what acting should accomplish." "No," Al replied, surprising everyone with his response. "I think we have the same goal, creating truthful, compelling characters that serve the story and move audiences. We just have different ideas about what it takes to get there." Al picked up his wine glass, took a careful sip, and looked around the table. "But here's what I know for certain. Whether you build a character from the outside in or from the inside out, whether you focus on technical perfection or psychological truth, the only thing that matters is what ends up on screen. And if that performance serves the story and touches something real in the audience, then the approach was justified." Al raised his glass slightly, a gesture that seemed both toast and olive branch. "So maybe the question isn't whether method acting is selfish. Maybe the question is whether we're all committed enough to finding truth in our characters, regardless of how we get there." The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had marked earlier parts of the conversation. This was contemplative, respectful, the silence of artists who had just engaged in a fundamental discussion about the nature of their craft. Meryl raised her own glass, her expression thoughtful but no longer challenging. "To finding truth," she said simply. "To finding truth," Al agreed. The rest of the table joined the toast, and gradually, conversation resumed, but everyone present understood that they had witnessed something significant. Not just a debate about acting techniques, but a passionate defense of artistic commitment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Years later, when film students studied different approaches to acting, This dinner conversation would be cited as one of the most articulate defenses of method acting ever recorded. And Meryl Streep, in subsequent interviews about her craft, would speak with new respect for actors who chose psychological immersion as their path to truth, acknowledging that there were many valid ways to serve a character and a story. Al Pacino had done more than defend his artistic choices. He had redefined the conversation about what it means to be generous as an artist, proving that sometimes the most selfish thing you can do is hold back from giving everything you have to the truth of a character.